Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Glad to be joined today by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. Today's the first day of the rest of your life, Josh.
It feels like it. I mean, for sure.
Josh and I just finished recording on the big teaching project we've made reference to here and again over the last few months. And, we're not, the class is ongoing, but a lot of the big, behind the scenes work of recording material we finished yesterday. So.
Yeah, it's an accomplishment. And part of it is like I'm embarrassed to tell people about it generally because it doesn't seem
it's just
like
work.
It's just work. And generally you shouldn't talk to, except for your spouse, you really shouldn't talk to people about your work ideally. But every once in a while you're like, how many students? Like, like over 1,000. Like, what?
Yeah.
And it's like, how much content have you guys? It's like,
a lot.
in the, would it be, more or less than 30 hours? It's definitely more,
Yeah.
So it's it is the first day of the rest of our lives.
There you go.
I'm feeling it. The birds are chirping.
Well, it's funny. Yeah, like I said, I went to see Jeff Tweedy last night, and there was a moment of sitting there in the Paramount watching the show, which I enjoyed fine, but also just the general sense of having a little mental space to be able to enjoy something was kind of nice.
Yeah.
Without back processing
federalism or interest group formation or whatever.
Yeah, and how to talk about it without getting fired. So, which is kind of a burden, but not a bad one, as you say.
Yeah, it was
as I've said all summer. Look, spending a lot of time on this. I'm not out mining coal or digging trenches in the hot sun.
No, and I said to you this morning. I mean, one of the things, at least for me, and we'll move on from this in a second, is going back and going over all this core, fundamental stuff about government, looking at the Constitution, thinking about the development of, institutions and rights and all these different kinds of things, honestly, in some ways, kind of invigorating now that it's done.
Yeah.
At least for me, I can say that.
I mean, I revisited thinking about things I hadn't thought about in a while.
Yeah,
it's always good.
Good for everybody.
Good for everybody, unless you're out there listening going, okay, get on with it.
Yeah.
So we had to skip last week due to other commitments. So we still have some, pent up thoughts on the most recent UT Texas Politics Project poll, some of which we'll talk about today, but who knows, you may be back next week mining that yet again.
Yeah. We want to give people something to listen to while they travel with their family for Thanksgiving.
There you go. Give
some road trip music.
Give thanks for public opinion. A lot of things going on in the news. Seems silly, not that we have to get into it, but not much, big national news story. Shutdown's over. And I think a couple weeks ago we did some public opinion, looked at some of the public opinion on the shutdown and talked about that in a, sort of parallel intro level newscast we've been doing for the course this week.
Yeah.
Shutdown's over, politics kind of swirling around that. Bumped off the headlines yesterday by the initial released strategically by Democrats initially, and then a strategic counter response by congressional Republicans of more documents, emails related to the Epstein situation, case, the history of Epstein and that. I don't know if there's anything you want to say about either of those. I mean,
on the former, I'll just say, because we didn't really talk about it too much in here, the quick takeaway from the polling on the government shutdown was just to say that, everybody was kind of getting dinged. I mean, and part of that is because, people from the other party would, disapprove of the job that, the other party's doing. Independents disapproved of everybody. People who aren't super partisan disapproved of everybody. But then the problem was, and we saw this in the polling, was that, but for the most part, like Republicans were mostly approving of the Republicans, on this. Democrats were mostly approving of the Democrats. And so, I think, to the extent the shutdown went on longer, than maybe than other shutdowns have and all that, that was part of the reinforcing factor. And if you want to get like highfalutin about, this is polarization. These are all these things, that we talk about all the time. And that's kind of why it was harder in some ways to get out of this
I think the
jam.
highfalutin part of that I think was important. I kind of emphasized that in talking to folks about in the initial wave of after the poll release that, for the umpteenth time, you could see, the negative partisan identification at work in the responses to the shutdown. As you say, Democrats were largely supportive of their partisans, Republicans largely supportive of their partisans and how they were handling the shutdown. But the disapproval of the other side was higher than the approval of your own team. And that, I think that did help extend it. And what we know about what we're hearing about the narrative, to some extent, I think supports that view. I mean, the fact that, the moderates in the Senate on the Democratic side who wound up voting to end the shutdown and were crucial to that happening, had decided a couple weeks ago, I think, that those talks were underway. And at least the reporting is that the Democratic leadership, Chuck Schumer, wanted them to hang on a little longer, at least until they saw what happened with the elections. Yeah. The Democrats did well in it.
And that makes sense. And
that was, kind of not inconsistent with that explanation.
Politics.
But,
and that was the other piece to the
poll.
And
politics in a highly partisan environment.
And the other piece to that is just to say that, the poll also found that, people are concerned about the cost of healthcare. So that was the Democrats' argument. That was there. We saw that on the uptick with, obviously a lot of attention to the increase in prices on the ACA marketplace, especially here in Texas. We've talked about that. But we also saw, just a general widespread perception, including among Republicans, that the shutdown was bad for the state of Texas. So it wasn't as though anybody was out there saying, well, good. I mean, now let me rephrase. There are some people out there who are saying that, but there were very few people, I think, who are out there saying this is just going to be a great because now we're going to say we don't need the government or whatever. Their views were pretty, I think, reasonable about that.
And it was, the way it unfolded in the last couple of weeks after we came out of the field was fairly. I hate saying predictable because it always sounds like, oh, I knew it. Yeah, and I don't mean that, but. In the sense that the longer it went on, as people, and we had kind of flagged this in the podcast a few weeks ago when it started, as the effects of the shutdown began to multiply, both the primary effects and the secondary effects, it was going to be harder for everybody to hold the line.
There are no real winners in shutdowns for the most part. They're just who loses the least. And then on the Epstein stuff, that's one of those, I got to wait and see. I mean, of all the things that are floating around out there, this is the one that sort of, again, from even a public opinion standpoint, it surprises me the salience that this seems to have, especially in certain quarters of the electorate, in ways that just, I think defy a little bit of, reasonable expectations. There's so much that's always going on. And right now, more than anything, and I think it's funny, you mentioned it. Yes, it's like Democrats release an email or two, Republicans are, well, here's 22,000 pages, which really does reflect, I think, in a lot of ways, what kind of a lot of part of the, really from the top down idea of flooding the zone approach to this is, but it's also like I'm curious to see what the tail on this looks like, how long this stays in the news, because it has defied some expectations, at least for me. Well,
and there's a lot of other stuff that's in there that is going to give people other things to talk about, and whether that extends the tail or like what that looks like,
whether that works as intended.
Well, I mean, not to ignore, the obvious headline of, Donald Trump being mentioned and these ways that are not as clear as probably anybody would like.
Right.
On either side. Yeah. I mean, it's very Rorschach-y kind of thing going on here probably. Mm-hmm. But kind of the secondary stuff that's coming out of that, I think is, who knew, Epstein had like a correspondence relationship with Larry Summers, right? I mean, not that I'm shocked by that, but it's and even more so. I was, with a, long-time member of the press last night, and we were talking about the Michael Wolff part, and I don't know if you've seen that.
No.
Yeah, the author Michael Wolff, who's written these books about, you know who he is, and for our readers, he's written some books about Trump. Longtime journalist, he's done, but has always been kind of a controversial guy in terms of, his use of confidential sources. It's but even more than that, his relationship, I think, with some of the sources, and there's some really eyebrow-raising stuff in there. If you haven't seen it, go see the emails where, Michael Wolff is giving Epstein advice about how his communication strategy vis-a-vis Trump in a way that is, pretty shocking if you accept, some of the basic old school conventions of journalism. So for those of you who haven't seen it, those
also
emails
for your
are,
long Thanksgiving trips.
yeah, all over the place. But that's, if you haven't seen that, Josh, I almost noticed that more than the Trump stuff was kind of the Trump stuff.
Well, and that was the one thing for him is, and his allies, it's easy enough for them to say, well, we know about this. But
right.
I think, I'm curious to see whether that extinguishes it at this point or not. Because it does seem to not be going.
I think they're going to have a little trouble extinguishing it. But there is already, the kind of morning newsletters and looking at, kind of what's out there in the blogosphere. Mm-hmm. It will be interesting to see how it all, how this sorts out. But there's a little bit of reversion to the norm on this in terms of, the line, there's really, told you there's really nothing here. Yeah, well, you knew they knew each other, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I don't want to get too far into
Or you knew that and
parsing
everything else you're seeing is what we've been telling you anyway, or whatever. Yeah.
I'm expecting this to play out a lot like so many other things with this administration, with Trump, and in particular with this Epstein thing, is that at some level, people are going to revert, to some fairly predictable positions. And but been wrong before. Yeah,
we'll see.
So at any rate, also a couple of good, Texas current event hooks that we kind of want to focus on today, I think, that we can use as the points of entry for some of the data from the poll, some of which we talked about, some of which we haven't. And again, this is not earth-shattering news and there's nothing surprising here per se, but things to notice. And that is Governor Greg Abbott formally kicked off his re-election campaign this past weekend, I think on Sunday in Houston. There was a lot in that speech, and I wanted to excerpt the speech for the podcast, but it was a very windy night in Houston, and a lot of the audio that I thought was best. To be kind to our listeners, nobody needs to hear a bunch of wind blowing in a microphone, and when we can kind of give you the gist. And when we post this on the website, we'll all link the video to the post at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Just to frame it a little bit, it was an interesting mix of speaking to the moment in that pretty early on in the speech, the governor used a lot of affordability, cost of living framing to talk about, what was important, what the what they had done, and tying some of the things to that. I think, in my view, a lot of the achievements he was tying at the linkage was a little tenuous, but nonetheless, it did clear the way for talking about a huge expense for Texans, to paraphrase the governor, and that would be this kind of centerpiece that's gotten a lot of media attention and that the Abbott campaign has promoted on property tax reduction.
Right.
And we've talked a lot about property tax reduction in here.
Oh,
and there's a good, I do not take this as a policy analysis, but the Abbott campaign circulated a one-pager on this on social media and to the press, that talks a lot about what they're talking about doing. And, we were talking about it before, and you think about property taxes a lot. Everybody does, which is kind of or a lot of people do, which is kind of the point here. But, I was wondering what you made of this.
Well, I think it reflects the challenge that, Abbott is honestly facing both in the moment and just in the moment, as you said, of the moment, right? In terms of what people are concerned about, but also sort of the moment and sort of the longer term trajectory of the state and just sort of ultimately, what is and is not possible, right? Yeah. And and I think, one of the things is, the focus on affordability, not surprising, right? And part of that is we see it all over the polling. We talked about it.
They're doing any polling at all with any, general mood testing. They're
going to see the economy in there. They're going to see cost of living.
It's like everyone else.
Yeah, they're going to see cost of living, and there's a real concern. Housing's a real concern. And we've talked about this before, but, the legislature, or really, honestly, Texas in and of itself doesn't have a ton of levers at its disposal to really dramatically address these sort of things head on. But the best, I don't say the best, but the most obvious, maybe, if not the best way they can attack this problem is through, taxes, fees, the costs of living that they control loosely, and they don't really directly control it. But it sort of walks up into the sort of tricky thing, which is, again, we've been cutting property taxes like consistently for the last decade, like, and aggressively with increases in the homestead exemption. On the flip side, the legislature has, we just had, a tax rate election here in Austin that failed Prop Q. The legislature.
On the same day, we had a constitutional amendment election that passed.
Another huge increase in the homestead exemption.
And a couple of carve-outs.
A bunch of carve-outs. I mean, well, actually, to be clear, I think 2/3 of the 17 proposals on the constitutional amendment election had to do with taxes or a reduction in taxes or a prohibition on taxes of some sort. And so this really becomes the vehicle. But the challenge is that and the other piece of this, which is also part of this pronged approach, is to keep the localities from increasing taxes too quickly.
Right.
Well, again, this went from an 8.5% rollback election trigger to a 3.5%. And then there was discussion, obviously, at the end of the session to say, well, what if we did 1%? And we talked about this in here, that just the practicality of that is non-existent. Just to wrap a bow around it really quickly in terms of the fact the elections would probably cost more than the savings in a lot of cases. Yeah. And most localities would be having elections to approve every single budget. And in some ways, that's kind of where it went off the rails. Now, this is where I think campaigning and actual legislating diverge pretty dramatically, right? And you look at sort of, what Abbott is proposing, broadly. And again, this is just campaigning. We're adults here. You can say whatever you want, and ultimately, he's not in the legislative branch. But ultimately, what he wants to do is he wants to tighten those spending limits on localities. And right now, it's sort of do something kind of like the state does with its budget and sort of have some sort of an additional lever to control it based on inflation or population, right? So that's one possibility. But the other side is, if there's going to be if there's going to be a tax rate election, majority is not enough for that. We need 2/3.
And we've heard this.
We've heard this
floated in the legislature before.
Right, and then the other one was, essentially give Texans or give local voters the ability to initiate a rollback election, basically in this case, but it only requires 15% of voters to do that. And I think, what do I think? I think this is a reasonable, way to approach the issue from a political standpoint.
Right, because certainly our polling has shown that on one hand, you've got all these actions that they've been taking, and partisans appreciate it.
Yeah.
But it hasn't changed a lot of people's baseline attitudes about property taxes being too high and their expectations that they're going to have to pay more in the future.
Yeah, well, and I think there's
pretty consistent results, right?
Well, and there's just sort of I hate to, be bitchy about it, but there's just such a basic math aspect of this is when they sort of say like, okay, we're increasing the homestead exemption from $100,000 to $140,000, which is a huge increase, right? 40% increase. That's a humongous increase. And so what's that going to save the average? They put all these calculations. Well, save the average homeowner about $450 or somewhere in that range. Whatever, $400 or $500, and then you say, okay, cool, divide that by 12. Right. Yeah. And then you're talking about, the way that most homeowners see it, which means they don't really see it because, we talk about everything that we've been constantly being reminded of over the course of the last year about, well, how much more do eggs cost? How much more, is electricity costing, right? Because the electricity rates are going up in all these places. Because of data, in a lot of these places because of data centers, other things, increased demand. How much more does everything cost? And it eats up this savings almost immediately.
Right.
And that becomes the challenge here is that you're sort of forced to say, we're addressing your problem. No, really, we are. Don't you know? No, we're not. We're not actually asking because when we ask, people are kind of like, yeah, I don't know.
Well, and there's the other kind of macro level aspect of this, which is, the two things that stick out to me about this are one, and you've done a good job of posing why this is happening to some degree, which is
stylized that. But
well, the idea that, if you're going to do this.
Yeah.
And you're going to try to reduce property taxes and hold all other revenue generating sources equal, you've got to put the pressure on local governments.
Yeah. Yeah.
Full stop, right?
Right.
And that has implications not just that are fiscal, but also in terms of local governance, decision making, local autonomy, all of these things that have been brewing now for 10, 15 years now. Mm-hmm. Kind of came to a head session before last with the so-called Death Star bill. Mm-hmm. And this is, another big step on that. But in that direction, and just looking at the language of the campaign, looking at their campaign one-pager, you just kind of the state of Texas does not levy any property tax.
Right.
Period. Local governments control your property taxes and can raise them. But there are limited options for taxpayers to lower their own tax bills. So, the focus on local government and local governance is a very interesting kind of macro level development here, you know.
And yet familiar, right?
I mean, by this point, it's not a surprising step,
but
other than the specifics that you were talking about and, you know, frankly, the impracticality of a lot of it.
Well, it's interesting to me because, I mean, again, it's not, and it's just to lay it out quickly, it's not surprising to see this turn towards local governments because ultimately there is no Democratic figurehead to run against. There's no Democratic president. The Democrats aren't controlling the Congress. There's no clear statewide leader of the Democratic Party to point to and say, this, you know, let's go after this guy. And truthfully, you know, paying attention to Gavin Newsom is a sideshow and, you know, useful when useful, right?
Right.
And so ultimately you're left with the cities. But I guess I wonder, and I mean, I'll pose this back to you. I mean, I wonder just thinking this far out, you know, if this becomes sort of part and parcel of this approach is like, how does a campaign potentially, and I mean, I'm looking at this, I'm not thinking this is crazy, just knowing what I know about the environment, largely, or at least primarily centered around sort of, you know, chastising the cities of Texas.
Right.
How far does that take people? I mean, in terms of addressing the problems that we're talking about?
Well, you know, I think this kind of goes back to the overall composition of the speech the other night. And this is why I really wanted to quote some stuff. So they had a, you know, buy some wind protectors, guys. You know, the speech was an interesting amalgamation, you know, as these rollout speeches are, you know, there's nothing that different about this. It's also the same with a victory speech, right? I mean, we'll see. There was a definite mixture of, I mean, the tax section of the speech is actually not that long.
Yeah.
Right. It's not really, to my mind, the centerpiece rhetorically of the speech. You know, there were lots of, you know, the greatest hits.
Yeah.
You know, immigration enforcement.
Right.
You know, a lot about, you know, economic growth in the state and, you know, a lot of, you know, very classic Abbott touch points. So I think in that sense, I mean, you know, it's funny. We were talking about media and strategy in another context earlier today offline. But this is another kind of manifestation of this, you know, there's always a little something for different factions in a political speech like this. That's not new.
Yeah.
But I mean, the extent to which
even before TikTok,
there was definitely, you know, a lot of other parts of this speech that will be bolted onto this and that were still good applause lines. Yeah. You know, with the crowd.
Right.
So, you know, it's easy to focus on this, and I think, you know, for us, it's a little bit.
Well, but it's interesting.
You know,
but I mean, I do think it's important.
It's easy to drill down into the policy stuff and to look at the bigger trajectory stuff. But there's a certain amount of business as usual going on here.
But I think it's important to focus on this because ultimately, you know, this is a two-step process, and right now, you know, Abbott needs to win the primary, which he is almost certain to do. Yeah, and he's done a remarkable job of clearing the field of any potential, you know, serious challengers to that.
$80+ million plus the potential to raise still more will do that for you.
That'll help. But also he's taken on, you know, some niche issues that, you know, if festering can lead to just annoyances, you know, in terms of the primary. And so I think, you know, it's not surprising to have, you know, him hitting these things. I mean, obviously he wants to max out vote totals. He wants to be the guy. I mean, all those things. But I mean, I think what's notable is knowing what we know about where the electorate is right now in the economy and, you know, not expecting, and there's, you know, I'd say there's mixed currents out there for sure, but not expecting a wholesale, you know, turnaround in terms of people's perceptions within the next year. I think this is an important piece to focus on because I think, you know, when we went into the last legislative session, we said to people, hey, what is the thing they should be focused on? They were people were focused on cost of living if they weren't focused on immigration and the border, just to say, you know. And in general, the concern about costs has not gone away, and it's a bipartisan concern. I mean, that's something else that's really important here. This isn't just Democrats wringing their hands because Trump's in the White House. Yes. We see it among Republicans, too. They're concerned about the cost of housing. They're concerned about the cost of living. It's there. Maybe a little less intense, but it's
it's a trope in the press, right, in, you know, the national media right now that while that, you know, Trump's advisors want him to talk more about affordability, they want him to be available more domestically and to hit those notes.
Yeah, it's a little challenging.
But it's challenging, you know, and it's challenging for him in particular, I think, because he doesn't, you know, that's really not his mode to talk about. I mean, the reflex has been to go and say, yeah, this is more, I think, Bessent, or the Treasury Secretary, rather than. But kind of going back and saying, well, look, we inherited this mess, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which, again.
But I mean, what I think about, where I can't help but, and again, we're just speculating off into the future, but it's a podcast, is what this is. One of the things I can't help but thinking about is O'Rourke's run against Abbott. And, in that election, again, not a good year for Democrats, what have you. But, we generally, at that point in time, we still saw immigration and border security as a top issue here. Yeah. Top issue among Republicans, big issue for independents. And because of the border crossings, it was increasingly an issue among a lot of Democrats. And, one of the criticisms that I levied in this podcast against O'Rourke is that, his position on immigration was kind of unknown. And it was kind of really the sort of thing that he just avoided. And I think, you can't run in a campaign in a statewide election, look at what the main issues of voters tell you about, and just sort of seed the field in this big issue. Yeah. And I think if you flip these around a little bit and you say, okay, well, if the 2026 elections are largely people focused on the economy, Abbott can't very well not talk about, people's economic conditions, cost of living, this kind of stuff. And I think, what we've seen, and we saw it in the legislative session in terms of the way what they were willing to do and what they couldn't do. And what we're seeing now is that this is the vehicle by which, Republican statewide leadership has chosen to address the cost and affordability problem.
Yeah. I think, I haven't really thought of, we kind of talked about this a little bit. I think we had Darren on the pod a couple weeks ago, but as you're saying that, it's also like, I think I said at the time that you could also vector this concern with property taxes and the dissatisfaction to the it's aggravated by the broader economic concerns. It's almost like you could add property taxes to the list of things that people are price sensitive about.
Well, yeah, right? I don't want to make this
There's a different way of putting it.
Well, I don't want to make this too hyper local, but if you've been in Austin and you know about the Prop Q vote and how that went down, there were a lot, people say, oh, well, even Austinites getting sick of their property, whatever. Yeah. There's the various, sort of stone throwing that's going on. But if you kind of talk to people around town, there's just a lot of people who you would know who, as generally pretty progressive or liberal people, who are just like, oh, geez, I don't know. Another one? Can we just and because and that's because the economic pressures were, for most people, kind of overwhelming whatever other sense they had about these things in a way that's very reasonable. Yeah. And so I think, the question becomes, again, outside of all the other factors is, how effective of a vehicle is this to address people's concerns, and is cloaking it in this notion of, well, it's the cities that are doing this to you. It's not the Republican statewide leadership of the last 20 years. I think, look, there's a case to be made. We're increasing the homestead exemption. We've been doing all these things to try to make your cost of living more manageable. But I guess what I wonder is, does this as a vehicle, is this effective? When you say, we talk about issue ownership, where whoever the Democrat comes in and say, well, geez, whatever they're going to say, Texas doesn't spend anything on people, blah, 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 low social safety net, they want to, blah, et cetera, et cetera. I just wonder which is going to be the more effective, how effective that's going to be, Yeah,
well.
Given that we know that these constant property tax reductions haven't led to people saying, boy, this is so much better.
Well, and I think they are trying to anticipate a little bit of the campaign in here. And if you're going to anticipate, and one of the proposals that's not on the sheet in the notes, because there's another page to this that isn't here, but one of the things I really noticed is that one of the proposals is to, is the promise to try to delink property taxes and school funding, which,
Yeah, that's actually a real approach to potentially.
Right, but it's also a real approach that would require a pretty big bucket of money from the legislature.
Well, yeah, given that, not to go back into the course mode, but given that the state is constitutionally required to establish and set up that system, if they take
and to balance the budget,
and to balance the budget, that's a big lift,
right? And that it's not been. There's already a big predicate among Republican primary voters and Republican legislators say, no, we support the public schools, but the problem is they're spending, they're wasting money in superintendents and administrators and DEI and whatever. There's not, there is not a critical mass for reallocating another big chunk of recurring money to the schools, period.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But it's an interesting rhetorical trap, I think, if you are running against a Democratic candidate who wants to ding you on public education. Mm-hmm. Because then you can say, look, we are trying, we're going to fix this. And the problem is we're going to fix two problems at once with property taxes and education. And then so are you telling me you're not for cutting property taxes?
And increasing public education
right.
funding.
Oh, so that's what you're saying.
Yeah,
so what are you
right.
going to do?
Yeah, right.
Right. And there's an answer to that.
Yeah.
If you're
a
deft campaign candidate.
You raise the real issue though, which is, and I'm just going to say, as absurd as the notion under the current revenue generating structure that we have in the state of eliminating the property tax, which some people, including the governor, have floated as a perfectly reasonable policy idea. The problem is on the Democratic side, you're in the position of saying, oh, so you don't want to get rid of the property tax?
Right.
And it's like, well, so you want to keep it? You want to raise it? Like, what do you?
Well, and look, as a friend of mine was pointing out recently, very clearly, you would think that Democrats would be able to say, look, you can say whatever you want, but this is you. You have been in charge.
Right.
You are running for a fourth term.
Yeah. Why haven't you done it already?
I mean, why are we still talking about this if you're so sure this is the solution? What have you been doing?
Yeah.
But, will they do that? And, do you have somebody that's capable of really delivering that message and sticking to it and, in a powerful way? And we'll see. So,
yeah, we'll see.
But let's look, the other thing that's linked to this. So, Governor Abbott gives a speech, declares, puts his hat formally in the ring. 2 days later, endorsed by Donald Trump.
Boop, boop. There you go.
Pretty helpful in it doesn't really matter, but helpful in a Republican primary. I mean, Governor Abbott is not a state legislator looking to fight off a challenger or something. But it does, point to Trump's position in Texas vis-a-vis the statewide here.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no doubt that he was going to endorse him. I think, in some ways, getting it over with quickly, in some ways, is almost like, I don't want to say it's like, it to me, it almost shows less value in it. In some ways, like, you're not saving it for a special moment when you need it. And part of that's because he just doesn't need it. But obviously, if he didn't get it, it would be weird and all that kind of stuff.
It can be in all the, appropriately targeted ads from day one.
Yeah, exactly. So that's, that is what it is. But it's an interesting moment in the arc of like where we are in time, looking at the public opinion data, both for Abbott and for Trump, really, right? So, I mean, we can make a lot of points of comparison, but I mean, it's been interesting to watch over the course of the year, sort of when we started really looking at these ratings in, maybe December or February, depending on what ratings we're looking at, and then sort of through to October and seeing, in some ways, and I'm going to phrase it this way, and you can kind of, you push back or, you adjust. But I mean, it seems to me that as we've watched, Abbott really get closer to Trump, or whether Trump has pulled him in, or whatever metaphor or analogy you want to use, it doesn't really seem like it's benefited Abbott in the public very well. And as we've seen Trump's numbers trend downward in the overall electorate, we've also watched Abbott's numbers trend downward as well. And it's hard not to look at those things together. And part of it is just the nature of the underlying data, right? So, I mean, let me just kind of like lay out some of this. You jump in whenever, But if we look at where Greg Abbott was, a real high watermark was at the end of last year in December. 55% of Texans approved of the job he was doing, 34% disapproved. Maybe they were fat and happy on, Christmas, Hanukkah, whatever. February, he was still at 48-37. So very healthy job approval number. If we jump ahead to October right now, he's at 39 approved, 50 disapproved, which is the worst rating of his entire governorship, which is an interesting. I mean, it's just interesting to bring out. As he announces for re-election, this is actually at his worst rating. In December, among Republicans, he was at 83% approval. In February, he was at 82% approval. Today, he's at 76%. So
still strong.
Still strong. Now, for Democrats, in December, he was at 61% disapproval. In February, he was at 75%. Now, this is notable. I just want to point out because historically, what we've tended to see is that, when Abbott is, I think, his strongest and most adept, he has a certain matter-of-fact authority about himself and the things that he's taking on in a way that, generally appeals to at least a small minority of Democrats as well as other people. And he usually would get some level of approval, which is why the disapproval was
kind of high single digits, and at the highest points, kind of low doubles.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, at certain points, years ago, many years ago, it could get up almost into the 18 to 20, 15 to 20 point range.
That was during the initial COVID thing.
And even before that.
Yeah.
But since then, we don't see that as much. But again, in February, 75% disapproval. In October, among Democrats, same as August, 89% disapproval. Right? So we look at that. We look at independents. He was at 23.39 in February. Today, he's at 24.58.
Yeah.
Not great.
That 58 is a troubling number,
Well, and that's
I think.
well, that's
I mean, it's not, again, not fatal or whatever, but it's,
Well, what it is the
not
same,
helpful.
The same questions people are asking us about Donald Trump, I think, point us to questions about Greg Abbott. And it's not about, like, oh, is Greg Abbott in trouble? And we're not fools. We're not going to sit here and say Greg Abbott's in trouble. You shouldn't listen. If you're listening to a podcast and someone's like, well, Greg Abbott's in trouble, I would say, listen to our podcast instead, probably. But I think, there are warning signs of a challenging environment. And some of this is the stuff we've been talking about, the economic stuff, but some of it really has to do with the types of groups in the electorate that we think of that are key to how competitive an election is or not. And we think about independents, we think about Hispanics, and we think about suburban voters largely as like a good barometer of kind of what the mood looks like.
And on the other side, how mobilized are Democrats? But we'll get to
that, right?
Yeah.
But if we look at where, Greg, the movement among Greg Abbott among these groups, in February, he was at 23 approve, 39 disapprove among independents. Today, it's 24-58. In February, among Hispanics, he was at a pretty respectable 40-42. 40 approve, 42 disapprove. Today, it's 29-58, and that 29 approve is a low for him. In the suburbs, back in December, that's just a number I pulled, he was at 49 approve, 40 disapprove. Today in the suburbs, it's 36-54. If we think about the really fast-growing, competitive counties in the state, like that's what we're talking about. And we don't have to go into all these numbers. I'll just say this kind of tracks what's happened with Donald Trump. If we just focus on those groups, if we say, look in the suburbs, he was at 51-41 in February entering the presidency. Today he's at 39-54. And among Hispanics, he was 44-46 in February. Now he's 32-59. So these are sort of the groups that, we would say this is what's going to make the environment more or less competitive. And then I think for us, what I'm looking at is thinking, okay, so what is the messaging that Abbott's putting out there look like, given that, here's the parts of the electorate that he needs to probably a little bit of help mobilizing and sort of bringing back.
And look, the property tax thing speaks to that.
And the property tax thing speaks to that. The suburbs, for sure. Yeah. And when you talk about Hispanics, really just to say it out loud, like this is the plurality group in Texas. So what are you talking about? You're talking about a lot of people who live in the suburbs. You're talking about a lot of people who live in the cities. You're talking about a lot of Texans, and so it is right down the middle in terms of when you think about persuadable groups and what they care about. And again, we've been talking about this a lot, but the lack of just sort of durable partisan attachment among Hispanics. This is a persuadable group here right now, and this is a group people are fighting over. And I think the real thing I noticed when looking through the polling data, some of the change is that and we talked about this years ago, but I was noticing it again. What's changed for Republicans isn't so much that I wouldn't say that their ceiling is so high because who knows what the ceiling is, but the floor has gotten higher. In terms of when we say, like, what share of Hispanics are approving of the job, Greg Abbott's doing, Donald Trump's doing, Republicans. And Donald Trump, I think, is probably largely to credit for a lot of that, along with Republican efforts to mobilize these voters more generally. But the floor is lower. I mean, it's just like, Democrats, there's not like an unlimited number of Hispanic voters that Democrats can just keep going and keep targeting, right? But nonetheless, Democrats need this to even be competitive. I mean, that's the other way to flip this, is to say, is Greg Abbott in trouble? No. The other side is, can Democrats have an environment that's, gives them a chance to be competitive? And you look at this and you say, yeah, possibly. I mean... Yeah,
I guess...
However, there's some challenges still.
Well, I think that's right. And I think, and look, this I shouldn't even say wrestle with. I mean, the uncertainty that I have, in mind, front and center, is you look at these numbers and you also look at, the things we talked about, and we talked about these on the podcast with Darren a couple weeks ago without being too repetitive. But, the overall theme of the last couple of polls has been people are not in a great state of mind about how things are going. Right. And so we can trace all those declines in approval levels and favorability ratings. But when you look at that also in the context of the track numbers, the economy numbers, I don't really want to, I'm reluctant to, and I had some people ask me this recently, say, the leadership's numbers are down, they're vulnerable. Now, that could be true as a function of the overall environment, but it also makes me reluctant to say, as you caveated, this candidate is in trouble.
Yeah.
This incumbent is in trouble because, look, if it, in some senses, they're just all in not the greatest space right now. And, look, we've been through enough of these cycles as they get into campaign mode and start sending out public messaging and making public contact with their base, as they start running a campaign without
spending that $80 million.
Right. And you have a lot of money to do that. We know what the partisan environment is, that there will be very likely some reversion to more of a mean pattern here, which will probably boost the in-party ratings.
Yeah.
And I think that gives me, it makes this, the thing that we've talked about endlessly in here, and we will talk about endlessly again until November.
Right.
What is the reliability of the traditional midterm pattern for the art party, blah, 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 all of that, which everybody knows what I'm talking about. So, and we look at, and the big question is the Democratic numbers, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
and the state of the Democratic Party, which
Yeah.
this shutdown thing, again, could help in the medium term, but in the short run is re-raising all these questions about, WTF is going on in the Democratic Party and what are they going to do?
Yeah, and I think that comes up in the numbers, right? So, when we ask about favorability numbers towards the parties, first of all, it's not surprising. I think we mentioned this already. It's not surprising how a majority of voters disapproving of both parties or having an unfavorable view of both parties, which stay, that's all the opposing party and some significant share of independents, right? So they should be
because the
underwater.
independents kind of hate everybody.
They hate everybody. That's why they're independents. But, the Republicans are in a better position than the Democrats in Texas right now. 38% have a favorable view of the Republicans, 51% an unfavorable view. Among the Democrats, 31-54. So it's a little bit worse for the Democrats. But this is the notable thing that you're talking about.
Yeah.
80% of Republicans have a favorable view of their own party. Only 69% of Democrats say that they have a favorable view of the Democratic Party right now. 18%, which I'd say it's almost 1 in 5 Democrats, have an unfavorable view of their own party.
Because the kind of default mean of, looking at the, for both parties, you should be at least in the high 70s or the low 80s.
Yeah.
And
the Democrats have historically, at least in Texas, looking back over the trend, have been a little bit lower than Republicans.
Right,
but the Democrats...
That makes sense, though. When your team's losing all the time.
Yeah. But they should be at 3/4, let's just say. I mean, it doesn't have to, we're not even talking about intensity here. They should have at least 3 out of 4 Democrats should say, yeah, that party that I'm part of.
Yeah, we like those. I like my guys, fine.
Now, I mean, the leaderlessness of the Democratic Party is obviously, making this a challenge right now because what it is and which Democratic Party do you support?
Well, and, again, there's that problem. And just at the Texas level, and Democrats are having that problem nationally.
Yeah.
And it's worse in Texas because, as I'm broken record on this, the weakness of the Democratic Party in the state has become a structural feature of Texas politics.
But what's really interesting to me, just to I think it might even wrap this up, we'll see, is that, the one thing that's been really notable in the polling to me, one of the big shifts or one of the big changes that we've noticed is, with Donald Trump ascending to the presidency, one of the things that's really fallen off of the public's agenda in Texas, and it's crazy to say this, is like immigration and the border. Republicans are significantly less concerned about this issue than they were. Republican statewide leaders are obviously talking about it a lot less because they can't criticize the federal response. And whereas we used to see, 60% of Republicans saying, the immigration border is the most important issue facing the state, now they're kind of splitting out across. They're focused more on the economy.
Although it's still high.
It's still high. No, it's still a top issue. The economy is creeped back up.
But I think it's in the high 30s or around 40 now.
But the more important thing for this is just to say that is to focus on these Democrats is that for Democrats who usually it takes a million issues, whatever, it's all these things. But now, 40% or more are saying political corruption, leadership. And that's whether we say most important problem facing the country, most important problem facing the state. And just to say, we don't need a bunch of, complicated measures. They're focused on Donald Trump. Donald Trump, I would say, coalesces Democratic attitudes pretty clearly. If you watch the candidates right now who are trying to mobilize Democratic voters, they're talking about Donald Trump. They're talking about political leadership because they know that's what Democratic voters are talking about. And to the extent that Greg Abbott has, again, pulled closer to Donald Trump's orbit, that may be all that's required to coalesce the Democrats back together who are, a little bit less happy about what's going on. And I think that's also sort of the challenge here, and sort of saying, Greg Abbott goes, hey, I'm running for re-election. There's Greg, there's Donald Trump. All right, get him out of here. Because honestly, he doesn't really help him that much.
Well, and again, to this question of how do we tease out responses to particular leaders from the general thing, and what that looks like in June, let alone September of next year.
Yeah, right.
I'm throwing up my hands.
No, fair. We've seen enough to know, let's see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the combination of the unpredictability and, the kind of, the uniqueness of the current economic moment.
Yeah.
With the idiosyncratic nature of Trump's leadership and Trump's presence in politics. I was talking to somebody last night. I think you and I were talking about this recently. I mean, there's a certain fool me once, fool me twice thing here where, you could look right now and see, like, there are issues right now there are tensions in the Trump coalition.
Definitely.
Right, in the party. How does he manage that? How much does that continue to manifest, when it comes to election time, when you start getting people really focused on campaign messaging?
Well, and the challenge here is we always raise is the issue of negative partisanship too, which is to say that, absent, a particular Democrat who's leading, obviously, on the one hand, Democrats have to sort of deal with every sort of error that comes their way. At the same time, as much as sort of Trump's approach to governing has created a lot of opportunities for policy entrepreneurs to try things within the executive branch, the lack of leadership on the Democratic side also means that there's a lot of opportunity within this chaos for Democratic entrepreneurs to emerge to try to sort of take the mantle of leader. And to your point, there is no handicapping how that is going to go over the the next 6, 8, 10 months, right? Like, and that's the sort of who knows?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many things that it's so it's just so tempting to bet on the historical pattern here.
Yeah,
but
I'll be honest.
You still seem like you're leaning that way to me.
Well,
I could be wrong. But
No, I am, and I'll tell you.
I'm not wedding you to that. But
No. I am, and a part of it is, and it goes back to and it honestly goes back to the polling data, and it goes back to looking at the polling data for just so many years. Like, Trump is a wild card in the way that he, influences sort of these things that we think we know about politics, right?
Yeah.
I mean, whatever. That's fine. I just also think that the economy is one of those things that's just, we talk about all the time. It's just something that, and we're here, we're big old nerds, right? We're following every little piece of this. And you all are big old nerds too. You're with us, okay? But, most people are just not that engaged with this stuff, and their engagement has to do with their feeling of how things are going. Yeah. We already know that governing is hard. We already know that Trump has not chosen to govern in a bipartisan, bring along everybody kind of way. He's done it in a very, very partisan way that in some places really excites people, in some places really terrifies people, but also, is a wash for a lot of people who are still just going to say, man, I had to move. Yeah. Rent got more expensive or whatever, right? And so I just sort of, when people say, hey, like, oh, all those negative and economic polling numbers, that stuff, that's not real. More often than not, in my experience, it's real. Yeah. And I think the sort of motivated arguments that people come up with to tell you why it's not real, or the fact that, Trump's holding the coalition or Democratic disarray or whatever. And it's like, yeah. But like, most people are just like, yeah, the economy's not good, so who do you vote out?
Yeah, I mean, it's a cliche.
Or I'm less motivated because I just don't think these are going well,
It's a cliche in the coverage right now, but it is, I mean, it was kind of a trope in the last week or so, the kind of Trump making the mistake that Biden made. Mm-hmm. Or, in terms of telling people, no, really, it's fine. Yeah. You're just, you may not be feeling it, but actually look at the numbers, or look at X, or look at Y.
It's just you just don't understand.
Yeah, right. And that's, it's a loser.
It's a loser. Yeah. No. Any political argument that begins, well, don't you think if people just understood, I just say stop.
Yeah, right.
That's a world that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
You got to deal with the world as it exists, and the world that exists, for what, take it or leave it. I think if you listen to this podcast, you probably would take it. It's kind of it's in the polling numbers, and it's very clear. And so knowing the historical trends, I'm reluctant to say that I wouldn't expect to see that. And I also would say, and we've made this point elsewhere, maybe here, but, I think Republicans see it too. Republican elites see it. That's why they're redistricting. Yeah. Because if they didn't think that, this was a real problem, if it really was okay, they wouldn't be going through all these efforts to try to change the map, because if they left the map as it is, they know what the outcome would be, and it would follow the historical patterns.
And again, just yesterday, or maybe this, whenever it was, I think it might have been even this morning, but, when the president signed the CR, mm-hmm. He was talking about affordability. Yep. And then didn't take any questions from the press. Yeah. Which is, interestingly enough, kind of conventional for a very unconventional guy, which tells me, to your point about Republican elites and the people mm-hmm. around him. I mean, there are people that are reading it through this frame and see it. Yeah. And, that is still, but it's all still very unresolved. And
how the elites resolve this is going to be tricky, because, as an elected official, you have to, you're selling anything. You got to speak to where people are. And to the extent that, and we've talked about this sort of in the context of the budget and all these other things, but to the extent that, there's no room for any Republican running for office to acknowledge any sort of difficulties other than those created by the previous administration or created by undocumented immigration, which is clearly much more under control now.
Right.
It just sort of means that you just sort of have to avoid this issue. And I just think that puts you at an additional strategic disadvantage that's already on top of the historical trends.
I mean, there's something that, is just occurring to me, and this is half-baked, that I may retract this in the next podcast. But all things being equal, it does seem to me like it's one thing to seek to reframe people's, in some ways, inchoate cultural identity issues in the way that Trump did during his rise.
Okay.
It's another thing to tell people, no, let's think differently about the fact that you have less disposable income.
Right.
Or that you're living check to check and you're coming up short.
Right.
It's just,
or that your healthcare expenses are about to go up by 1,000%.
Right. Well, I mean, the thing about that is, and that's part of the Democratic issue, and this, we need to close out. Maybe we'll come back to this, but that's also part of this calculus about who won and who lost from the shutdown, and are the Democrats losing in the short term, and maybe they'll come back and this will rebound to their benefit in the long term. Is that hasn't quite happened yet?
Yeah.
Or at least the big predicted, because of the subsidies and all this.
Right.
There is something about that material part that, it's hard to say, no, that's rain on your back.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's nice, warm rain.
Yeah, exactly.
And I just think we haven't come to the crisis point for that yet. But if that is what it's going to be about, then the Democrats, should be getting ready to fight that fight. But there's a lot of agency involved in that. So with that, thanks for making it today. Thanks for the ride to work today. Thanks to our excellent production staff here, as always, in the Liberal Arts Development Studio here at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to you for listening. You can find the data we talked about and more, of course, as always, at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. Have a good rest of the week. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.